He's only able to stay until 4:30.
Okay. Okay, now that's fine. Then we'll go up to 4:30.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. President, I thought of a question I should have asked you when we were dealing with your suggestion for Mr. Brown Molefe to be appointed. While Mr. Matuna was one of those suspended, and the question is this: whether you were aware that Mr. Matuna was in fact, I'll use the word, fighting with Eskom to come back with the board, to be reinstated to his position. Whether you were aware of that fact.
I heard of it. I was not fully made frontally aware, but I heard that he had wanted to be reinstated.
Yes. And along with that is having encountered him, either, you said they were reporting to the IMC, or having encountered him as an executive at Eskom, did you get exposure to him to the extent that you could formulate a view on his capacity or competence as a CEO of Eskom?
Mr. Matuna, that is?
Yes.
Yes. No, yes, I should say yes. I did encounter him, and I did get a sense of his competence. But in the end, my own thoughts about him was that whilst he was good and a fairly efficient official, Eskom was such a huge organization that, in my view, it required someone with more experience, who had run a fairly large organization which had so many parts to it and divisions. So, very, very honest individual, hardworking, and the fact that he had not run a large organization of a more or less engineering nature, in my view, meant that there were challenges.
On the day that he was one of those suspended, there is a report he makes to the board on the 11th of March 2015. And that is captured on that page in Bundle 5, Chairperson, page 135. Page 135 of Bundle 5. And he's reported to have said, the CE, which is the chief executive, had developed a turnaround plan which was being updated and put onto a firm foundation. The initial presentation had been used at the board induction and presented to the Deputy President. And I believe this was referring to yourself, Mr. President.
Mm-hmm.
And he goes on, the minute goes on to say the CE was in the process of engaging labor and trade unions. Staff morale was a serious challenge that was being explored. He stated that the turnaround strategy considered all initiatives and tabled them at the war room for consideration. At the last war room meeting with the Deputy President, Eskom had advised that they had responded to all requests for information from the war room and had requested that management be advised of any gaps. And the question is, Mr. President, do you have any recollection of him, Mr. Matuna, presenting the strategy, turnaround strategy, that he had prepared for Eskom to you?
Yes, I do recall that. I would not immediately now know the full contents thereof without having renewed my own recollection of it. Yes, I mean, ESCOM always had a number of ideas of how it can be turned around, and one of his would have been one of those as well. So yes, one does recall that, but I also recall the reports, or rather the provision of information as it is set out here in the document that the Technical War Room had requested, because the Technical War Room needed to deal with information that had to be provided by ESCOM itself. And therefore here, as it is set out, they did provide information, and in the end it needed to be properly assessed and evaluated. And I do recall that the advisory team that I had appointed always had a sense that there were always gaps in the information. They always felt that they didn't get as much information as they wanted. So this, having been assessed, would have led to people like those putting forward their own evaluation and saying this is still missing and that and so on. But when requested, they did make the attempt to present information.
The question, Mr. President, which I was going to ask you is this: without going into the details of that turnaround strategy, can you recall if that turnaround strategy created in you the impression that this is a man who was now getting to grips with the issue at ESCOM, so that when he gets suspended along with others, you would have wondered, but why suspend this man who just not so long ago showed me what he was doing positively to turn around ESCOM?
The answer to that would be yes. The plan, however, needed to be properly evaluated. As I said, a number of such plans had been put forward, so it needed to be properly evaluated as to can see whether it is in the end implementable. So one needed to weigh that up with a proper, almost evidence-based evaluation to see if it had the efficacy that it seemed to suggest.
In her affidavit, Ms. Lynn Brown talks about the meeting she had with the former president, Mr. Jacob Zuma, where Mr. Zuma raises with her concerns about information given to the war room by ESCOM's executives. I want to know from you, and you can tell the chairperson, whether as the person appointed by the former president to play that strategic role to oversee the turnaround strategy, had he raised those concerns with you as well, that information given to the war room was either inaccurate or incorrect?
No such concern was ever raised with me by former President Jacob Zuma about information that was being provided to the technical war room from ESCOM. No.
Did Minister Lynn Brown raise the concerns with you?
No. To my recollection, no.
Okay. this might be an unfair question to you. Who could have possibly, if we accept the information or the version by Ms. Lynn Brown, that the concerns were raised with her, who could have possibly informed the former president about matters that I think should have come to your attention before they go to him?
I frankly would not know, which goes back to the issue that I raised, that to refer to it more colloquially, as I did before, I guess, the entry points into ESCOM from government side were just far too many. And just to count them again, it was the minister of the minister herself, it was me as deputy president, it was the president, it was the board, it was the IMC, it was the technical war room, and so those were the entry points. So I wouldn't know who the information would have come from. Mm-hmm. And this is what I found most concerning. And hence I made the proposal that I did. Of course, you have to add the CEO as well and all that to all this, that mixture. Mm.
Yes, because that precedes the ultimate suspension of the executives. And then comes the suspensions, which have, the reasons for which have nothing even to do with the inadequacy or otherwise of information given by them to the war room. And then, as I indicated, the observation is that the path was paved for those executives who were sympathetic to the Gupta's cause to be appointed. But with that, you had also the board of ESCOM, which the evidence before the commission shows that to a small or greater extent, those board members of 11 December 2014 had connections with the Guptas or Mr. Essa. And the question, again, Mr. President, is whether the ANC Deployment Committee played a role in the appointment of those board members.
As I indicated earlier, some appointments came to the deployment committee, some did not. So I have no recollection about the appointment of those then board members to the deployment committee. So some did come, some did not come.
But would it not be highly unlikely that the appointments of an entire board of such an important entity as ESCOM would escape the attention of the deployment committee? Is it not highly unlikely?
We're dealing here with a period where a lot of things were happening without the line of sight of a number of people. So it is that type of situation we are dealing with.
Okay. Mr. Cyril.
Lastly, Mr. President, dealing with Mr. Koko's allegation that your statement that he should be removed by the board, your statement in January 2018, was an interference into ESCOM's affairs. But I'm going to ask a different question. In responding to that, you went into great length to explain why you intervened as a shareholder, and the basis on which you intervened, you refer to the MOI, the provisions of the MOI that entitle you to intervene. And you set out the remedial steps that were taken as a result of responding quite aggressively or forcefully towards executives against whom allegations of corruption were made, and that you were addressing the governance and leadership challenges at Eskom.
Yeah.
That is in January 2018. Again at the National Assembly, on the 10th of June 2015, bundle Eskom, not Eskom bundle, bundle 5, page 153. So it's the same bundle in front of you.
What page did you say?
153.
Okay.
You will see the date of the meeting of the House National Assembly is 10 June 2015. And Mr. President, you start speaking at the bottom of page 152. You see that, Mr. President? Mm-hmm. It says, Honourable Speaker, as honourable members will know, education is critical if we are to build a fair, equitable and prosperous South Africa. But I want to come to page 153. As we reported in the presidency budget vote debate, notable progress has been made in turning around Eskom. I did say that the appointment of the acting chief executive officer has been a really good shot in the arm of Eskom. SA Airways, SAA, and the SA Post Office are also being turned around. With the support of the war room located in the presidency, progress has been made in the implementation of government's 5-point plan on electricity, particularly as well as the elements of the government support package. And this is my focal point, the next statement. Governance and leadership challenges at Eskom are being addressed as we speak. Now that's 10 June 2015. Mr. President, the executives had been suspended, and at this time they were either gotten rid of, and I would say also being paid harsh money to leave. We were, as it were, the picture at this stage is actually going south at Eskom. And I was wondering, when you're saying governance and leadership challenges at Eskom are being addressed as we speak, whether in fact you were speaking to certain steps that were being taken to address those challenges, and what you perceived or understood those challenges to be in June 2015.
Well, I guess the challenges would have been, yes, at a management level. And also, I guess, maybe stabilizing the board. I don't now recall what we had done in relation to the board. So I don't immediately recall the contextual situation there. But it was 2015, so I think progress seemingly was being made, but as you said yourself, Eskom is very complex. There were a whole number of other balls that were falling through the cracks, either at the operational level, commercial level, and otherwise. So that's what one would have been referring to.
Yes, no. I suppose you will tell the chairperson, why did things go south as they did when the IMC was there to oversee the turnaround?
Well, it's a fairly straightforward issue. The operational issues that have had to do with our SOEs have been very complex. And they've had to do with whether you had the right people in place or not. And at the IMC level, we would only really get involved in the strategic issues more than with the operational issues. And I know that people would at times expect that once you have an IMC, it means that all problems are resolved. But you only really deal with the strategic issues, the areas of focus, but you still need those operational people, your executives and all that, to actually do the work. And with ESCOM, it's always proven to be quite a difficult and a complex type of task. And I would say, you know, up till today, it's almost like a day-by-day type of situation. You take 5 steps forward and 2 steps backwards the next day, and you try to move forward. This lapses, and this breaks down, and so it's a complex one. And it's complex because it's such a major operation that has so many components, so many power stations that are aging, that are even the new ones. I mean, we just recently had an explosion at Modupi, which, as you listen to it from a technical point of view, you begin to realize the complexity that, you know, certain things were not done right in terms of opening this opening and that opening, hydrogen coming in and another gas coming out and explosion happening. So those are the complexities. So it's not an easy one, as you said yourself. It's a complex, but it can be done, and I'm confident that it can be turned around, as we are trying to do so right now.
Chair, that concludes my questions.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Selega. Mr. President, let's go back to the question, to your answer to Mr. Koko's allegation.
Yes.
Which was, as I recall, that you as Deputy President interfered in the area that should be dealt with by the board of ESCOM and said he should be fired. Now, there are 2 possibilities. One is that because, as I understood your evidence, you were saying what you said then was justified. There are 2 possibilities. Either you would be saying there's nothing wrong generally with the Deputy President of the country representing the shareholder to say to a board of an SOE, fire that employee, don't keep that employee. Or you would be saying, generally speaking, that's not what the Deputy President should be doing, even representing the shareholder. But in this case, it was done because there were special circumstances which justified it. Which of the 2 is it?
It would be the latter. It would certainly be the latter, because it was exceptional. And we were facing a situation, and I remember very clearly, where I was, I think, departing, going to Europe, to the World Economic Forum. We held a meeting with a number of role players, business and unions and all that. And the view that was expressed was lack of confidence in ESCOM. And it even got worse when the funders of Eskom also expressed their views, and some more directly to some of us, one or two of the ministers, including myself, that, and it was put as Eskom is the biggest risk that the country faces, but at a sovereign level in terms of its death and all that. So it became such a strong and pointed question with both lenders in the country and lenders outside the country. And it was not a singular or a one person's decision. It was a decision that was taken by, a group of us, the President, myself, and I think one of the ministers. I think, as I said in my evidence, in my input, we met and we discussed this matter and said, we are facing this risk, and it's got to do with serious doubts in relation to the board as well as to management. And the stories that were going around about at the management level, people implicated in wrongdoing, were not positive for Eskom. And so therefore action had to be taken. So it was exceptional, one accepts that. But as the shareholder, we needed to take action. And action that led to the decisions that we finally took. So ordinarily, even a minister or a deputy president should not really get involved in decisions like that. So it was exceptional because it was the country interest that we were looking at more directly, because Eskom had been said to be the biggest risk that we were facing, the country was facing from a sovereign debt point of view.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Selega.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
My colleague, the Sony, will.
Okay. Mr. Soni. Mr. Soni, we'll put questions to you, Mr. President, in regard to PRASA.
Yes. Good afternoon to you again, Mr. President.
Good afternoon to you.
Yes, Mr. Soni.
As you please, Chairperson. Mr. President, I just sketched the background against which my interaction with you this afternoon is going to go. A fair amount of evidence at the Commission has been led in respect of state capture or the capture of PRASA, and you'll understand why I'm saying that. I'm putting it in those alternative terms. Now, as regards the capture of PRASA, the main witness here is a leader of the ANC previously occupying a formal position in the ANC, namely Mr. Popo Molefe. And he came and gave evidence here about his tenure as the chairperson of the Board of Control of PRASA from 2014 to 2017. And what emerges from his tenure as the chairperson, that he was one of the few people PRASA who had political influence, who tried to use his influence to turn PRASA around from being captured. And he said in his evidence what he tried to do. He tried to explain why all his efforts failed. Now, that is, in fact, the main issue I want to raise with you. The other significant issue that I want to raise with you is the failure to appoint a board for a period of more than 3 years until the High Court in Cape Town virtually last year forced the minister to appoint a board, or directed the minister to appoint a board. And then the failure to appoint a CEO for more than 5 years. And this is in respect of an SOE that it was clear in the public eye was floundering and in trouble, in need of leadership at both board and CEO level. But the value of Mr. evidence, Mr. President, is this, that when one looks at what his board did, whether they were successful or not, what is quite clear is that his board, when it tried to do something, was in fact made, as he called it, dysfunctional. Its term of office was allowed to run to an end, and for 3.5 years, no board was appointed. Now, the questions that he asked the chairperson to consider is, please join the dots and see if there is method in this madness. That's part of what I want to exchange with you, Mr. President. Now, Mr. President, in order to make these matters familiar to you, a set of documents relating to PRASA was given in the bundle. I do not know if you've had an opportunity to just familiarize yourself with that bundle.
Advanced.
Okay. Well, at least you're aware of the nature of the issues. Okay. Now, I don't necessarily want to refer to the documents. I've tried to encapsulate in what I'm going to put to you what is contained in the documents, but should you need a reference to it, I will give it to you. Now, just in general in regard to, and when I say Mr. Molefe, I'm going to distinguish, because I know we've been talking about a different Molefe a few minutes ago. I'm going to say Mr. Mpopo Molefe, and I think he deserves that distinction to be drawn from the other Molefes. Now, Mr. Molefe makes allegations during the course, or made allegations during the course of his evidence, to 3 entities or groups of people who can be categorized as follows. Those who did nothing against state capture at PRASA when they should have. Secondly, those who appeared to side with the capturers, and then those who refused and continue to refuse to act, notwithstanding their being under a constitutional and statutory duty to do so. Now, I don't know if it's any comfort to you, but to the extent that he refers to you, you would belong to the first category, namely, he approached you about certain things, and you as part of the top 6 did nothing about it. I'm going to then, having prefaced this, introduce the aspect of Mr. Molefe's evidence dealing with you in your capacity as a member of the top 6 with whom he had a meeting. He had a meeting, he says, sometime in July or August 2015. He can't remember the date. And I ask you if you recall such a meeting facilitated by the ANC's then treasurer, Mr. Zweli Mkhize.
Yes, I do recall. I do recall.
So, this is the approach I'm going to use, Mr. President, and I do it out of no disrespect. I just to shorten it and get to the nub of things, because what emerged from questions that the chairperson, and I want to take us there as soon as possible, raised during the period Mr. Molefe gave evidence, is that certain concerns were raised by the inaction of the top 6. So I want to get through, just paint the facts, have agreement on that, and then the explanations will, I hope, take the major part of the afternoon. Now, he says the meeting took place against the following background. Firstly, there were a series of public attacks on Mr. Molefe and his board by Mr. Montana, Lucky Montana, the then CEO of PRASA, who was on his way out. It says at that time too, there were concerns relating to the findings, very adverse findings, that the then public protector, Ms. Tuli Madonsela, had made against especially Mr. Montana and PRASA as a whole, and the maladministration there, and against the other important issue, which is, I suspect, the reason that Dr. Mkhize wanted this meeting, is a confession from a beneficiary of a 3.5 billion rand contract, locomotive contract, who had told Mr. Molefe that after he had been encouraged to tender for this in an area that he doesn't practice in, he was asked to donate or give money to people, a sum of about 79 million rand, for that money to be diverted to the ANC. That's the confession that Mr. Molefe received. And it is in that total context that this meeting took place. I just need to ask you, are you aware of these 3 matters I've raised as being part of the background to that meeting?
My recollection may be challenged. However, I clearly recollect, I have a clear recollection of Popo Molefe asking to meet the top 6, which meeting did take place. I have a recollection of him raising the challenges that they were having, or he was having, which he articulated as acts of corruption at PRASA. I do recall that. I also do recall him mentioning the attacks against the board and him by Mr. Montana. I have no immediate recollection of this 79 million rand donation that was mentioned. I have no recollection of that. But the 2 certainly I have a recollection of. Yes.
Now, I suppose in a sense the reason he approached the top 6 was to deal with, seeking some guidance or assistance how to deal with the issues at PRASA. Now, this is what he said. He said that when he approached you, and we should get this, I say he met the top 6, but he made the point that the chairperson of the ANC, Ms. Leka Mbete, was not present at the meeting, so it was effectively 5 members of the top 6. Yes. I didn't want to create a new structure. I think the ANC has enough of them. Anyway, he says that this is what he said to the members that he met, the senior members. Said, you are the ruling party, meaning the ANC. SOEs are governed by laws, and you, as the ruling party, are the custodians of the Constitution and accordingly custodians of the law. He says, the ANC leadership approved his appointment as the chair of the board. It in effect deployed him to be the chair of the board. But the board, he said, was being subjected to these attacks. And he regretted the fact, and he pointed this out to the senior leaders, that they had stood by silently while this attack was going on by an institution, in a sense, to which he had been deployed. And he says he was informing you that he had been quiet all this time, but he was now going to act by using the applicable laws like the PFMA, because the board has fiduciary responsibilities to deal with corruption at PRASA. Now, just as a general proposition, Mr. President, does that accord with your recollection of what Mr. Molefe said to you at that meeting?
Yes, Chairperson, it does accord with what he articulated to us. And in articulating that position that he felt he should take, he received nothing else but support, because we formed the view that he needed to use the various processes and structures that are given rise to by legislation to deal with these matters. And I guess you're going to go to the second issue, which I would also like to respond to and like to expand a little bit more. Yes.
But in general, I mean, what he has said in his evidence is correct, and you want to add other issues that come up. Before you do that, though, can I say that what he also said, because he was probed on this, and he said that he was deeply concerned because the Public Protector's interim report was now available to him, and they made some damning findings against Mr. Montana, some of them not complimentary at all. For example, that Mr. Montana would not cooperate, would hide documents from the Public Protector, a constitutional institution, and he was required to assist her to finalize the report, which had already taken 4 years. Because of this sort of resistance to cooperation from Mr. Montana. And many employees were being dismissed or suspended without due process, which is one of the findings of the Public Protector. And he wanted to put a stop to that. But he also says that the Public Protector's report reflected that the amounts involved in some of the maladministration were not quite small. One of them involving an entity called Siangena on the Public Protector's report was amounted to 1.9 million rand. And just to take the process forward, the High Court found earlier this year that that contract was invalid, and by that time it had blown to 2.8 billion rand. So that's the other one. And then the third one is the Swifambo contract, and this is the one where I was saying that 79 million rand had been paid to the ANC. And he says that this was not rumors he'd heard. He heard this from the person who had been the beneficiary of the contract, who was afraid that there were investigations and he didn't want his entire business to fall as a result of that. Now, against that background, he said something that I suppose must be said in public. He says that he told the leadership, "You are doing nothing because you wanted to see if Montana's campaign would lead to the defeat or the collapse of the board." That's what he says he told Top 6. I say all of this because it's quite clear that one leader, and I can say this because he was this premier of the Northwest, that's the accord that the organization gave him. This is one leader now saying, but this is what effectively you are doing. You want the board to collapse. That's why you are not interfering. Can you recall if it happened, the meeting transpired in that fashion?
You have painted quite a picture which not fully, in agreement with, because when Mr. Popo Molefe came, it was like, this is what is happening to me as the chair of the board, being attacked, and the board as well. This is the decision that I've come to. I'm now going to use the PFMA to ward off this attacks, unwarranted, he said. And on that, we agreed. But he also did raise the issue of things that were happening at PRASA, and wanted us to act, to deal with some of those issues. And I don't know whether he recalls this, but one of the things that we did say is that just as you now are saying you'll use the PFMA Act, those things that are wrong, that are being done at the PRASA level, should also be subjected to the right structures and authorities and laws and processes, so that they can, one, be investigated, two, be dealt with, and there can be proper accountability. And this is like a standing position, and which was also confirmed by one of our conferences, that to the extent that there is the type of malfeasance which is reported to the structures of the ANC, there must be active follow-through through the various structures of the state, because the ANC, and indeed its various officials, Secretary General or otherwise, they do not have the power, the capability themselves to be able to do anything about these matters. We must rely on our state agencies to be able to do this, and therefore all these matters must be reported to those agencies so that something can be done about them. And sometimes some of these things come across said, and sometimes they are contested. And if they are, the best institutions to deal with them are those institutions that have been set up to follow these matters through without prejudice, with a great deal of fairness and a great deal of investigative powers. And that is what was communicated to him. I don't know if he recalls that. So what we expected, therefore, was that the very positive thing that Mr. Molefe said is that I'm going to utilize the PFMA process, which is great, because that basically means that you're pressing a button and setting certain processes in motion at government level and for investigative processes, and similarly on these others. I must dispute this notion that the top 6 would have done nothing about all this so that the board can be collapsed. I must dispute that, because to me that is the realm of dark arts. It's too dark and too deliberate. And how could an ANC deliberately say that we will not do anything because we want the board to collapse? To me, it's inconceivable. It's there is some measure of evil behind it, and I don't believe that that would have been something that would have been intentionally done by the ANC. And I guess maybe he reaches a conclusion on his own in that regard, and I have never really heard that articulation, because I would never imagine that any one of the top 6 would have that. And I suppose maybe it's a perception, it's a conclusion that one reaches, that you are not helping me because you want this entity to collapse or whatever. To me, that's dark arts.
Of course, Mr. President, you are aware, as we all are, that when it comes to the issues of state capture, there is a proposition that good public servants, good people who were dedicated to their job, wanted to do their job honestly and properly, were sometimes pushed out to make way for others who would be put into their positions, who would cooperate with those who were pursuing the agenda of state capture. And I suspect you accept that may be so, generally speaking. What you are saying is you don't think that would have been the case with the top 6.
What you are saying and suggesting may well be the case, and I'm not disputing that it did not happen.
Yes.
But certainly on this one.
Yes. Yes.
Having been part of the then top 6.
Yes.
It is highly improbable, highly inconceivable that we could have hung Popo Molefe out to dry so that the board can collapse. To me, that could never happen. It would have meant that we had a bit of a herd mentality, all of us, that this is now what we decide should be done. Let's collapse this board and let's hang Popo Molefe out to dry. Let him sink himself. It could never have been. Never.
Mr. Sonny?
As you please. Mr. President, I just want to ask one question in relation to, we know who wasn't there. Can I accept that former President Zuma was at that meeting?
Yes.
And you'll understand the relevance of this in a little while. I just wanted to get that out of the way. Now, this is what Mr. Molefe said the reaction of the top six was, which is one of the reasons his evidence on this issue took a little more time than it ordinarily would have. He said the reaction of the five leaders was as follows. We were not expecting this. We are going to have another meeting. You have not given us enough time to think about the issues you are raising. This is what he says was the reaction. Is his recollection correct?
Could well be, but on the issue of the PFMA, very, very clear response. But as I recollect, it was also about him as the chairperson of the board having sufficient power, even sufficient capability to do something about this. Because if you are chairperson of an entity, you've been given the wherewithal to be able to act. Various structures of your board, it's either the audit committee, the risk committee, your HR committee, and if not, then your criminal justice system entities. So you do have the capability. And what did surprise me a bit was, why would he seek our permission?
Well, as I recall, his evidence, Mr. President, he was not seeking your permission.
Okay.
I think he said, and Mr. Soni will tell me if my recollection is not correct, what he said was that he wanted to get your support as the top six because of the challenges he found at PRASA, basically about corruption. And my recollection is that, unfortunately, he did not get that support because certainly my recollection is that on his evidence, it was like the matter would be looked at sometime in the future, and he said nobody, including you, Mr. President, came back to him to say, you know, that problem that you raised, we want to look at it, or how are you doing? He said nobody ever came back to him. So, but he said he came to seek your support because he believed that he had been deployed there by the party.
I find that a bit disingenuous for a person who has been clothed with all the powers of a position to then say, I felt powerless. And the support that he sought on the issue of a PFMA was a given. And he said, this is what I'm now going to do, because I'm being subjected to these attacks, I am going to use the PFMA. And we said, go ahead. And I find it disingenuous that someone who's a chair of an entity would then say, I am powerless and I need your full and total support. And when he would and should have known that it would be there anyway. And so the question is, he should have gone ahead. He's the chair of the board. When you are chair of the board and you find there's malfeasance, your audit committee must act. Your risk committee must act. And if it affects your CEO, CFO, your HR committee must act. If not, then you use other state agencies.
Well, Mr. President, let me say this. The PRASA issue is a depressing issue. I've had a lot of evidence. It is a depressing issue. One of the things I don't understand is how it was possible that for something like 5 years, there would be no CEO, permanent CEO appointed. And I asked myself the question, well, the minister responsible was aware of this situation. He ought to have been reporting to either the president or the cabinet. And I think I did specifically ask him the question, and I think she said that is Minister Dipuo Peters. She used to make reports. I can't remember whether I said cabinet or president or both, but I seem to think she may have said cabinet as well, apart from the president. How this situation in such an important entity, state-owned entity, could be allowed to just continue? How was this entity supposed to be successful when it had no leader, permanent leader? At some stage, the board, actually, Mr. Popo Molefe's board, as I recall, had acted diligently in recruiting a CEO and presented a recommended or preferred candidate to the minister, Ms. Dipuo Peters. And the candidate was not appointed. When we asked her questions about that here, quite frankly, her explanations left much to be desired. She gave explanations that are difficult to understand. They leave you with the question, but how was it possible? Was she not reporting to the president to say, this is the situation with PRASA, it's got no CEO for so long? Was this matter not reaching the cabinet? Wasn't the cabinet asking the question, but how can we allow this to happen? The evidence that I have had includes a situation where from, I think, around 2012-2013 financial year, up to 2018-2019 financial year, if I'm not mistaken, or 2017-2018 financial year, where irregular expenditure was going up astronomically. And I said to her, but somebody is supposed to have put a stop to this. Every year it was just going up. All of this time, nothing happens. So I'm simply saying, Mr. President, it's difficult to see how in a government something like this could happen for so long, and no obvious, no remedial action seems to have been taken. You allow a situation where there's no permanent CEO for 5 years, and the entity is riddled with all kinds of allegations of corruption. So I'm making that point, Mr. President, to say it may well be that Mr. Molefe thought, you know what, I need to get the party to assist here, because within state machinery, not much seems to be happening. And my recollection is that he didn't think he was getting much support at that point from the minister concerned. So I just mentioned that, Mr. President, and maybe I should add, and then you can deal with all of this. An ANC or ruling party that is interested in appointing, in who gets appointed as members of boards and in who gets appointed as CEOs of entities, state-owned entities, one would expect would be an ANC that would be interested in finding out how those people are discharging their functions in those entities. Therefore, if the ANC didn't seem to be so keen to get involved here, it's difficult to understand, because one would think the ANC would be entitled to say, we are the ones who go to the electorate and say, vote for us, we will give you a good government, blah, 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 blah. So if we deploy you to those entities and you mess up, you give us a bad name. Yes. So we won't allow it. But from what I heard in terms of Mr. Popo Mlefe's evidence, it seemed that the ANC was not so keen to be party to sorting out this problem.
Chairperson,
I said a lot, Mr. President.
You have indeed, yeah. But Chairperson, let me say the following. I did say, I did address the issue that you've put very frontally on the table when I gave my evidence as president of the ANC, the then deputy president and president of the ANC. I did concede, and I want to concede it today again, that there was system failure. And I concede that today as well. That there was system failure, and we should have been much more alert. We should have been much more active in terms of enforcing accountability, and we weren't. And the issues that you are raising now are matters that, not even going forward, but even right now, we're doing differently. And one could say that this process that you are involved in of going into the depth of what state capture has been all about has galvanized us to make sure that we start acting properly in the correct way. Yes, we do need to look at the past, but I think for us it's good to look at the past with a view of correcting the future, but also dealing with the present. And we are now dealing with that. On the issue of, for instance, state-owned enterprises, it is precisely in setting up the State-Owned Enterprises Council, we are trying to address and correct this challenge that we have had in the past, where state-owned enterprises were acting and operating in silos, and in ministries, in silos, and no one had line of sight. And Cabinet itself never had line of sight of what was happening in each of the state-owned enterprises. And we're correcting that, we're putting that right, and I've been insisting that everyone who's in the executive must have line of sight of what each one of us are doing. We need to know, because in the end, in terms of our constitution, we take collective responsibility. And the ANC itself, we already taking, you call it remedial measures, we're taking corrective measures. And the corrective measures are such that those who are deployed in various positions as party cadres, either you are deployed as a mayor, as a premier, as a minister, you've got to be accountable. And we've started the process of evaluating and assessing those that we have deployed in terms of whether they are acting according to what they were deployed for, precisely for the reason that the ANC has to go out to the public to canvass for support so that it can achieve its own objectives and the objectives of our people as a whole. So, systems failure, corrective measures are being taken, and we can testify, or I can testify to the fact that what has gone wrong in the past is being corrected now and will be corrected for the future. And the Commission, as it does its work and will conclude its work, will be emboldening that process on our part, that all the mishaps and the things that we didn't do properly are now done properly. And we say thanks to your Commission that it is going to help us in doing that.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Soni?
As you please, Your Excellency. Mr. President, I had prepared a set of questions trying to go in some order, but I'm going to deviate from that order on account of some of the matters you've raised. I thought long and hard about the interaction I should have with you, given the nature of the evidence that has emerged from PRASA. I accept that there was an interaction at that meeting, and maybe one should concentrate not so much on the accusations that are being made thereafter, because I think that's going to be counterproductive. I know chairperson would need to find whose version to accept, but I want to put that aside for a moment. I want to say, and you might remember I asked you if President Zuma, former President Zuma, was at that meeting. Now this meeting took place between mid-July and mid-August, the meeting with the top six. Now, on the 20th of August, so that's 2 or 3 weeks after this meeting, Mr. Zuma called a meeting of Minister Peters, Mr. Molefe, Minister in the Presidency, Minister Jeff Kadebe, and he invited Mr. Montana to this meeting. This is a week later, 2 weeks later, and said, Mr. Molefe certainly got this impression, and it was not an impression discounted by Minister Peters, that President Zuma said, you must take this boy back, meaning Montana. Now this is 2 weeks later. So when Mr. Molefe says to the Commission, I got no support, he may be sort of blurring things. I'm not saying mixing up things. But certainly, if the head of the top six, after a meeting where he is told, use your powers, is told, take this boy back. And I mean, I'm not using the word boy, it was what was used at that meeting. Then, isn't there a problem with the way the positions, deployees are expected to fulfill the responsibilities And these are weighty responsibilities that the ANC places on.
And maybe before you answer, Mr. President, one can say, Mr. Soni, maybe in fairness to both Mr. Zuma and Mr. Montana, that Mr. Montana's evidence was that no such thing was said. Am I right, Mr. Soni?
He disputed that.
He disputed that, yeah. But certainly, Mr. Popo Molefe said that is what was said. And I think, I can't remember what Ms. Peters' version was.
Ms. Peters said, Chairperson, that that is Mr. Molefe's impression, but she was not disputing.
My recollection is that after I had asked her some questions, she seemed to accept that that it may have been said and Mr. Molefe may have been right. So all I'm simply saying, Mr. President, is in fairness to those people, I don't want you to have the picture that there is only one version. There is a version that denies that as well. But I think Mr. Soni's question is, if that version is true, does that not show a problem?
Well, as I said earlier, many of these matters are often quite contested and disputed. So, having not been at that meeting, I'm unable to even comment on the veracity or lack thereof of what transpired. But what I can say is that this is exceptional. It's not the norm. It's certainly not the way that people who are deployed in various positions are, instructed to act. It certainly isn't. And if that is true, I find it a bit surprising. But I would not expect that we would, in any way, shape, or form, be, that directive to people that we have deployed. Our default position would always be, we've deployed you, and we want you to use your precisely the talents that we recognize in you to deal with these matters and to deal with them as best as you can to execute the task you have at hand. And that's certainly what I have used as an approach for people who've been deployed.
Is it now only that you're becoming aware of this meeting between the President and Mr. Molefe and Minister Peters?
Yes.
Now, obviously you can't answer for it, and Mr. Zuma has not come, so we don't know what his version is. But one of the things that Mr. Molefe said was he found strange that a president who had so many responsibilities would want to interfere, and that's the word he used, in the affairs of the board, especially in matters that are within its purview. In other words, whom to appoint, because that's what the board charter requires. And I take it as a general proposition you would agree with that.
Yes, as a general proposition that should be the case. And similarly, it is when you've appointed a person to be a chair of the board that you expect them to be robust in dealing with the challenges that they have to deal with, and not throw up their hands in the air and say, I don't have support, when all the instruments are in their hands, from board charter, to the memorandum of incorporation, to the Companies Act, to all the policies in the company and everything else. That's where I find it a bit strange, and I've used the word disingenuous, that Mr. Molefe would seem to be suggesting that he was helpless and therefore needed the support of a higher body. When, as you put the proposition to me that he wondered why a president would bother about the little things that are happening in a board. So
maybe we should also put this before you, Mr. President, because maybe that might be part of the reason why Mr. Molefe felt he needed the support of the ANC leadership. Mr. Montana gave evidence here, and at some stage, if I can recall correctly, and once again, Mr. Soni will correct me if my recollection is wrong, said something to the effect that there were certain ANC people who wanted to get some business from PRASA, as I understood it, not in a proper way, and he said he resisted them. He said he resisted the Guptas and he resisted ANC people who wanted to get some business from PRASA improperly. So I'm just mentioning that to say there was that part of the evidence as well, and I don't know whether that might have been part of the reason why Mr. Molefe might have felt, look, maybe I need the ANC leadership to give me support. So I mentioned, I don't think he may have said that himself, but I thought I should just enlighten you that there was that element as well.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that Mr. Montana would have said that, because in the end, that's how a CEO should act, and say, this is outside of the correct processes, and I cannot act unlawfully or outside of the parameters of the PFMA or whatever. So it's a tool that he has.
Yeah. Mr. Soni?
As you please, you guys. I'm just going to deal with one other part relating to Mr. Popo Molefe's communication with you, because I do want to come back to the issue you've raised about, but you've got to stand up. If you're the chairperson, you've taken those responsibilities, you have to have the courage to exercise the powers that you have been given by legislation. I want to come back to that in a moment. But I just want to ask you this, though. So Molefe says that after his term of office ended, and it was not pleasant, we'll go through that in a few minutes, but he says he wrote to you and he wrote to you in your capacity as Deputy President, and identified critical issues and asked you to get PRASA back on track because it had become dysfunctional. Is that correct? That he did write to you at the end of his term. Now, he's not asking for assistance, but saying, look, please get this organization back on track.
I seem to recall, I don't immediately recall that letter, but I do recall, yes, his opinion in that regard, yes.
Mr. President, if you could just repeat that answer.
Oh, no,
your voice was too soft.
Yes, I apologize for that, Chairperson. I say, I do recall, I don't immediately recall the actual letter, but I do recall that type of approach from him to get, PRASA straightened out, yes.
I raise that issue specifically because what it shows is that notwithstanding that Mr. Molefe, in a sense, was, and I'll tell you why I say this in a moment, he and his board were cleaned out, and treated badly, he says, that even after all of that, he wants this organization to succeed. Whatever else, it must say something about Mr. Molefe as a person and his commitment to the country and to organizations in respect of which he's been given certain responsibilities. You accept that?
Well, without any doubt, I accept Mr. Popo Molefe's credentials in this regard. He's an outstanding and straightforward person, and that's why I'm a bit taken aback by his feeling helpless, because he's quite strong, he's quite forthright, and where he has taken action, he has been very, very successful in his forthrightness, without even asking for help. He just goes ahead and puts certain things in motion, regardless of the consequences. So his approach then on this, that he needed support, is a bit surprising to me.
Well, maybe.
And I'm sorry that I'm spending quite a lot of time discussing, the credentials of my comrade. He's a very good friend and comrade.
No, well, I must just say this, and Mr. Soni might have a different impression. I didn't understand him to be saying he was helpless.
Okay.
I understood him to be saying I could do certain things, but I would be more effective if I had support or I had a certain environment. I'm not sure, but I didn't get the impression he was saying he was helpless. And we know he testified that his board went to the Hawks and laid criminal complaints against those who were alleged to have done wrong at PRASA. His board even went to the High Court to force the Hawks to do their job when they were not. They seemed not to be doing anything about those complaints. That's so right. He certainly, they certainly seemed to try and do certain things. So I thought I would just at least mention my own impression that I didn't think he was saying he was helpless.
No, he certainly did. And I just want to put this, Mr. President, that to the best of my knowledge, he is, and that's why the investigation into PRASA is so intriguing, but also so frustrating, that he is the only chairperson who himself brought applications to set aside mega contracts, to set aside the Swifambo contract of 3.5 billion rand, and then initiated the process to set aside the Siangena contracts for 2.8 billion rand. And you will read in the evidence that he gave, he stopped 2 contracts together totaling 4 billion rand, just as about the time he took office, because there hadn't been proper processes, and that was shown. So you are quite right, Mr. President.
Thank you.
Mr. Molefe deserves that credit at least. He had the courage to save the taxpayers as much money as he could.
Well, in confirming what the evidence leader has said, it's what I know of Mr. Molefe, Popo Molefe's actions, deserves nothing but the praise, because he's really acted so correctly and properly in the interests of the state and our nation. And forgive me, I was reacting more to what I thought was being put forward as him feeling a little bit helpless. And he by no means a helpless type of person. I was told that the evidence leaders are the bomb squad. He is more than a bomb squad.
We do operate under the law. Mr. President, I say this purely for your own insight into state capture. The documents you've been given reflect some of what Mr. Molefe said. And there is one passage that I think all of us can benefit from. And this, I'm going to read it to you. It appears at page 593 to 594, but you needn't go there. I'll just read it to you. He says, for state capture to succeed, systems in organizations must be broken, must be weakened, and good people removed from positions and substituted by people who are compliant and would carry out the agenda of those whose objective is the looting of the public purse. That's the reason his board, which tried to stop that looting, had to be vilified and removed. This is what he says. I'm going to get to the vilification. He's not suggesting the leadership itself, but I'll get to that. But you'll find that at page 593 to 594. And I found that quite a profound insight into how it came about that state capture, certainly at PROSA, succeeded. But he also makes on page 545, Mr. President, the following point. He says he was in a position to speak out, but many people are not. As many are young, they buy a home, they pay a huge bond, they buy cars and send their children to private school. In order to maintain this lifestyle, they are required to please those in positions of influence and decision-making, either in SOEs or the party. And these are the warnings he's giving about how it came about that state capture succeeds, or succeeded certainly at PROSA. I just raised that to say that he has used his experience to give us the wisdom of how to avoid these pitfalls in the future. Now, I'm not going to go into this, but Chairperson, you will recall when Mr. Molefe gave evidence at pages 594 to 595, you raised a number of questions about why the top six didn't do more. I submit that the President has given his retort to that. Whether it's a full answer is a different issue. But what I want to do next, Mr. President, because I have limited time, we need to finish in a little while, so then Mr. Myberg can continue. I want to turn to the second category of entities that Mr. Molefe referred to, namely those who appeared to side with the capturers. Now, in this regard, Mr. President, and again, this is the total picture that he painted, which obviously would affect the insights he's given us. He deals with how his board was treated by the ANC members of the Portfolio Committee on Transport. Now, there is a bundle which I will refer you to, but I'm going to just summarize what happened there. But before I do that, I want to point out to you that the vilification by the Portfolio Committee members in Parliament came about at the end of August 2016. This meeting that starts on the 31st of August and goes on until March 2017. But what happened on the 25th of August 2016 appears to be the catalyst for this change in the attitude of the Portfolio Committee to Mr. Molefe. You might recall I said to you that at the 2015 meeting with the top six, or with the leadership, Mr. Molefe raised the question of this Swafambo contract. Now, in his replying affidavit in the High Court in that matter, Mr. Molefe set out in full how he came to know about the 79 million rand, produced the documents. In effect, Mr. President, this is what he said. He said that somebody at PRASA had been approached by Mr. Oswald Mashaba, who was the chairman of Swafambo, which was the winning bidder. And Mr. Mashaba said he wanted to meet Mr. Molefe. It's all set out in Mr. Molefe's affidavit. And he says that Mr. Mashaba said to him, look, I was approached by a Mr. Makenza Mabunda, the close associate of Mr. Montana, to bid for this contract for locomotives. I bid. I won the contract. It was a contract for lease, but it became a contract to buy. It came worth 3.5 million rand overnight, as it were. And after I won the contract, I was approached by Ms. Maria Gomez, who is an Angolan woman who purports to be a fundraiser for the ANC. And I was told to pay monies into different accounts, some associated with Ms. Gomez and others associated with other people, but which I was told by her, pay this money to. A total of 79 million rand was paid. I was told that money would be going to the ANC. I can't tell you whether it went to the ANC, but this is how it happened. Now, part of that was what the High Court found problematic about the Swafambo contract, and it set it aside. When Mr. Molefe's affidavit was filed in court in the Swafambo matter, not surprisingly, the press made it made headlines. That affidavit was filed on or is dated the 25th of August 2016. The Portfolio Committee meets on the 31st of August, and all the meetings are in your pack, Mr. President. I'm not going to go through it, but you can accept that I'm going to summarize what happened thereof. At the meeting of the 31st, I'm not going to name the persons, but I specifically ask you to look at that because there are some concerns that I will raise with you in a moment. In that pack, you will find that on the 31st, one of the items raised is that PRASA needs about 25 executives, but it has in the region of 60 executives. 60. Okay. If my figures are correct, but it's about that. Now, in fact, let me give you the figures correctly. You'll find it at page 642, Mr. President, of that bundle. It needs 20 executives. It had 65 executives. This is now put forward to the Portfolio Committee on that day by the acting CEO. Now, I would have thought, and I know I'm not an executive, but I would have thought that somebody concerned with good governance, as the Portfolio Committee should have been, that is scandalous, a scandalous waste of public funds. You are paying 45 people who ought not to be in those positions. And, Mr. President, some of them earn a lot more than you do. I can say that for a fact because I've seen the figures. Now, I'm merely saying that I would have thought, as a member of the Portfolio Committee, that's what I would concentrate. But an ANC member refers to this 80 million rand, angry with Mr. Molefe for raising it. Mr. Molefe says, can we discuss this in committee because it is sub judice? And he was told no. That's not my problem. These things need to be aired. But instead of concentrating on the fact that there was corruption, a new line of attack is taken. That Mr. Molefe had appointed a firm of attorneys in terms of a directive given by the public protector, Mr. President. And at that stage, it had cost 93 million. And that became the focus of the teach. Now, thereafter, a further aim, one of the people who participated says this was the ANC's tactic of deflecting attention from corruption. And effectively, what was being done when one looks at what happened in the Portfolio Committee meetings from the 31st of August to the time Mr. Molefe's board was dismissed ignominiously at the Portfolio Committee by the Minister on the 8th of March, they were subjected to this vilification. Now, it is that which Mr. Molefe is really complaining. Because he was not complaining about that on the 15th of in August 2015. But I'm merely saying that that's what he carries. Those are the scars that he carries with him. That he dared to bring corruption, the public for. That's the price. And so the point I want to make, Mr. President, and all of the people involved were targeting Mr. Molefe and his board. I've got to say to you, it makes shameful reading. I would like you to read, and instead of targeting corruption, they were targeting the exposers. It does not reflect well on the aims. And I say now that's not the concern I have. Remember, I'm talking two categories. The first was those. Then these are and effectively, this is what happened. A climate was created, dismissal of Mr. Molefe's publicly. Minister sends a letter to the Portfolio Committee. The Portfolio Committee announced the dismissal of the 3 months before. Now, what can be more embarrassing for somebody like this? But as you've pointed out, I believe it is a fraud, and he won. But it was a fake victory, as he points out. Thereafter, his board was made dysfunctional. another position. Some of them took them, some of them didn't, some of them didn't. But didn't have a board, to finish his office with the glory that he deserves. Because the prisoner of God is everything. He is the only leader in prospect, took on corruption head on, seemingly paid the price. And it is not good reflection on good governance, how good governance. Now, I want to then
I think Mr. President wants to comment. You know, you have said quite a lot, and he has been quiet. I think it's fair to let him say something if he wishes to.
No, just maybe a sentence or two. Just in reflecting on what Mr. Somi has said. What I would say is that we've come from a dark place. And I myself, President of the ANC, has said, and I will keep on repeating that we have drawn a line, because this is meant with a great deal of commitment that the wrongs of the past are being corrected, and we will continue to do so. Sometimes we will make mistakes, but we will always try to do the best thing that we can to move forward with the correct ways of working that we should and that we are expected to have.
You don't need to react to what I'm going to say, Mr. President, but if you choose to, it's fine, because I think I appreciate, of course, from what Mr. Soni has, Mr. Molefe and his board, what they were trying to do. You will appreciate that the picture that emerges is that of a board and its chairperson who approaches their minister for the job to be done that they need to do, as, for example, for a permanent CEO to be appointed. The minister doesn't do that. He approaches the top six. On his version, there is no support given. I know you have given your version, Mr. President, but on his version, he goes to the portfolio committee in Parliament responsible for PRASA, and he tries to get support. Instead, that is also not given. So I'm saying you have already dealt with it. I'm not asking you to comment, but if you want, it's fine. But that's the picture that seems to emerge.
I have dealt with it.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Soni?
As you please, Chairperson. Just again to complete the picture, and again in fairness to Mr. Molefe, that he did write to the chairperson of the portfolio committee asking for an audience, didn't get a response. He wrote to the Speaker of Parliament, didn't get a response either. He reported these matters, having won in court, he reported these matters to the Hawks. Having got no response from them, he asked that they investigate, and they started all sorts of stalling tactics. He took them to court, and in court they raised technical issues. And the judge was quite scathing that the police should, in the face of the sea of corruption, adopt such an approach. So again, when one looks at PRASA, one owes a great deal to Mr. Molefe. I know he has his detractors, but one needs to say that those who looted will hopefully be brought to book,
Yeah.
because he has exposed it all. Now, I want to deal, Mr. President, before I end, with the issue of the non-appointment of the board and the CEO. Now, in your pack, you will see that there is a passage from an affidavit by the late Kimi Mkwetu, where he says that he brought these matters to the attention of the minister. And the minister says that they were also brought to the attention of cabinet about the instability that the failure to appoint a board and a CEO during this entire period was creating. And as Mr. Mkwetu says, he says it's contributed to the collapse of the control environment of at PRASA. And the chairperson has raised with you the amount of irregular expenditure. It went from 0.1 billion rand in 2013-14 to 24.2 billion rand in 2017-18. It's all there in the pack. Now, is there a reason, Mr. President, that you're aware of why there was a failure to appoint?
Maybe just repeat that question, Mr. Sonny. Your voice goes down.
I apologize.
Yeah, is there a reason then?
Why there was a failure to appoint over all these years?
Yeah, okay.
I guess the reason would be the minister not executing their task, because the minister is the one who is supposed to actively seek to ensure that the boards of the entities that they are responsible for have proper governance, have boards appointed within the various time frames, CEOs, and all that. And I'm surprised to hear that the minister says that it was raised in cabinet, but it is the minister who comes to cabinet to discuss these matters, to propose these matters, and who, as we had earlier, would even go to the deployment committee and have names proposed, and even have those discussed, even say with the president. The minister must take an active role in all this themselves. And if there's a lapse at the ministerial level, then yes, you will find this type of problem, because even if they go to cabinet and they are sent back, they must persist and keep coming back and not sit back and just let things go to pieces. It shouldn't be. It certainly shouldn't be.
Well, a minister is under the supervision of the president, at least. I don't know whether a minister is also under the supervision of the cabinet, but certainly the president. So if the minister failed to do her job, then the president ought to pick that up.
Indeed.
Because the president is supposed to be interested in regular reports on the portfolio of every minister to see what the problems are, what is being done to deal with those problems, and whether those measures that are being employed to deal with the problems are effective in remedying the problems. And if the president, so it's either a situation where the president didn't make sure he provided proper supervision and therefore made sure he was aware of all the challenges and made necessary interventions, or the president maybe was not interested. But it can't be a matter of the minister alone. At least the president, maybe the cabinet might be a difference here, but the president is supposed to be interested in how every minister is performing their duties.
Absolutely correct, Chairperson. In case I seemed to be deflecting and not being very frontal in accepting the responsibility of their president, I don't want that impression to come across. Certainly, you're absolutely right. And it is for this reason that I have said that through the structure that we've now put in place, you will be able to reduce that type of failure, that type of weakness, because on your dashboard, through the SOE Council, we will have right across the board, we will have a proper line of sight of what is happening in each state-owned enterprise, from the balance sheet management to the income statement management, to the boards, how they function, and to also the operational issues as the reports come through. So through this new process that we've now introduced, which will be perfected in a little while, we will be able to have that line of sight. So we could say that, yes, the errors have occurred, as I have admitted here, but the process we're going to have now is going to be much, much better than what we've got now.
Now, Mr. President, the situation of PRASA, as I said earlier on, is a special one. Now, as I understand it, what you have said is, generally speaking, Cabinet would not be aware of what was happening in the SOEs, and you must just tell me if I'm misrepresenting your position. Now, with regard to PRASA, even before I came into this commission, I was aware for quite some time that in the media there were lots of allegations of corruption that were very often in the media. Wouldn't members of the cabinet pick this up and say at a cabinet meeting, there are these allegations that have been going on and on about this SOE. We should be interested to find out what is going on, what should be done. Does the president know about them? The minister involved? Can we be fully briefed on these matters? Wouldn't that be legitimate to do on the part of just cabinet ministers, even if as a minister you were not responsible for that SOE? Of course, I'm including the deputy president as well at the time.
Yeah, it would be, you're absolutely correct. It would be, except that we did not have well, let me put it this way, we had much more of a silo style of work, and which we have changed and are changing to a more integrated style of work, that we should all have line of sight of what is happening. And to this end, we've now introduced that on a periodic basis, the various departments or ministries, if you like, will come to cabinet, so that in a collegiate way they come and present everything they're doing. which has never happened. And if one gets to hear about the work of a department, you hear about it when either the annual plan is presented in Parliament, or when there is something, horrible that has happened in that department through the media, as you have said. So you're absolutely right. What would have happened in the past should have been raised by others in cabinet or otherwise, that what is happening, can we discuss it? But now it is something that would happen as a matter of course, because we have a much more integrated way of working, as I said in my initial evidence.
Yeah. Thank you. Mr. Sonam?
Yes. Mr. President, I'm pleased to tell you I'm nearly finished, so I'll perhaps be about 5 minutes more.
I've got all the time.
Mr. President, just in relation to PROSA, and as the chairperson has pointed out, PROSA is an especially troubling SOE in South Africa, because many of our people rely on PROSA for transport. And it is the poorest of the poor who suffer if PROSA is not working at full steam. And as a country, we owe it, especially to the vulnerable, to get it back on track, both literally and figuratively. But can I conclude what I want to say about, or my interaction with you about PROSA, by pointing out the following. PROSA presents an interesting illustration of how it is that the capture of an SOE can be successful. And I'm just going to illustrate 4 points in that regard. Firstly, for a long time, it was racked by scandal, public scandal, to the point where the public protector took 4 years to write a report, despite all the allegations made in public. At the center of it was a deployee, Mr. Montana. One of the disturbing things about Mr. Montana, and I know he has asked for my recusal, so I don't mind saying what needs to be said, though. He has said, at the meeting with President Zuma that Mr. Molefe refers to, questioned how it is that the Molefe board was appointed without his being consulted. That's how powerful he became. Now, I say this, and you are right to smile, Mr. President, and I know you do it because you're surprised. But the point is, the board is his boss, and he says to the president, consult me before you appoint my boss. I mean, that's quite frightening in terms of governance structure. But those are the Frankensteins that we can create. But more importantly, Mr. President, I've pointed out to you the Portfolio Committee, the Hawks, the NDPP too is approached. None of them have done it. And so the reason the capture of PROSA flourished was simply because, mainly by acts of omission, it was allowed to, the perpetrators were allowed to get away with it. And what we've got to do, Mr. President, is to create institutions, as you said, and I know it's a process, that are going to hold people accountable. Now, in addition